Michael stood outside the school gym with shaking hands as he held a small bouquet of blue flowers in one arm and clutched an old military jacket in the other hand. The sun was bright, but his eyes were filled with shadows from old memories and long nights. He looked around at the people walking in all dressed nice, with clean suits, shiny shoes, and fancy bags. Some smiled politely, but most barely looked his way. He was just a single dad wearing boots with worn soles and a faded shirt with tiny holes at the collar. His hair was short but not styled, and his face had lines that told quiet stories of long days and quiet pain. Today was Military Appreciation Day at his son's school, and he promised Jake he would come no matter what. He knew this day was important to Jake, who had written an essay about his hero. Michael had never been called a hero before, and he wasn't sure he believed he deserved it. He took a deep breath and stepped through the doors, hoping to slip in quietly. The gym was filled with people sitting in rows on metal chairs, all facing a stage decorated with flags, red, white, and blue ribbons, and photos of soldiers in uniform. A large banner hung across the top of the stage that read, "Honoring Our Heroes." Michael found a spot near the back where he could stand without being in the way. He didn't want attention, he just wanted to be there when his son spoke. He smiled softly, thinking of Jake, and how proud he felt watching his boy grow into a young man. As he waited, a group of parents nearby whispered and glanced in his direction. A woman with perfect hair and a pearl necklace leaned in toward another woman and said with a smirk, "I don't think he belongs here." The other one giggled low and said maybe he's lost or here for the free snacks. They both laughed quietly but loud enough for Michael to hear. He lowered his head and looked at the floor, pretending he didn't notice. Inside his chest something tightened, but he stayed still. He didn't want trouble, he just wanted to support his son. More people came in, and the gym filled with noise and excitement. Children in school uniforms stood by the stage, smiling and waving at their families. Some wore small military caps, and others held pictures of loved ones in uniform. Michael's eyes moved across the crowd until he found Jake standing with the other students near the side of the stage. Jake's eyes searched the room, then lit up when he spotted his dad. He gave a small wave, and Michael lifted the bouquet slightly in return. Jake grinned and turned back to his group, standing tall and proud. Michael felt a mix of joy and nervousness in his chest. He knew Jake was going to speak today, and he wanted to be there for every word. A teacher walked onto the stage and tapped the microphone, sending a loud buzz through the speakers. "Good morning, everyone," she said, her voice clear and cheerful. "Welcome to our Military Appreciation Day assembly, where we honor the brave men and women who have served our country and protected our freedom." The crowd clapped, and many parents smiled proudly as they looked at their children. Michael clapped too, his eyes still on Jake. The teacher continued talking about the importance of service, sacrifice, and family, then began calling up students to share their essays and tributes. One by one, children came up, some shy, some bold, all sharing stories of grandparents, uncles, or parents who had served in the military. Some spoke about battles, others about kindness and strength at home. Michael listened closely, each story reminding him of people he once knew and moments he had tried to forget. Still, the whispers near him would not stop. Another voice behind him said quietly, "He looks like a janitor or something. What's he doing standing back there like that?" Michael didn't turn around, he didn't say a word. Instead, he focused on his breathing, slow and steady, like he had learned years ago in training. He reminded himself why he was there and who he came to see. Then the teacher smiled wide and said, "And now we welcome Jake Anderson, who has written about someone very close to his heart." Michael felt his breath catch in his throat as his son stepped onto the stage, holding a paper in one hand and adjusting the mic with the other. The room grew quiet as Jake looked out into the crowd and cleared his throat. Michael's heart pounded as he watched. But before Jake could speak, something unexpected happened. The doors at the back of the gym opened, and a tall figure stepped inside, dressed in full military uniform, with medals gleaming on his chest. Heads turned, eyes widened, and a soft wave of murmurs passed through the crowd. Michael turned too, and his face changed from confusion to surprise to something deeper. He knew that face. He hadn't seen him in years. The man in uniform scanned the crowd, then locked eyes with Michael. And for a moment time stood still. The tall man in uniform stood still near the gym doors, his boots silent on the polished floor, as rows of eyes turned toward him, drawn by the shine of his medals and the quiet power in his presence. His name was General Carter, known by many, respected by more, and feared by few. But to Michael, he was something else, something from a past life. Michael's breath caught in his chest, his fingers tightened around the bouquet, and for a second he forgot where he was. The last time he saw that face, it was on a dusty base far away from home, under a sky filled with noise and heat and sand. Now that same man stood in the doorway of a school gym, surrounded by parents, teachers, and curious children. General Carter looked straight at Michael and gave a tiny nod, just enough to say, "I see you," without saying a word. But before Michael could react, Jake's voice rang out across the gym, steady and strong. "Good morning, everyone. My name is Jake Anderson, and I'd like to talk about my hero." The crowd turned their attention back to the stage the moment, with the general passing like a shadow on the wall. Michael kept his eyes on his son, but his heart was racing, two beats at once, one in the present, one stuck in the past. Jake held the paper in front of him, but didn't look at it. Instead, he looked out at the crowd and spoke from memory. "My hero is not a famous soldier or someone you'll see on TV. He's not in books or on posters, but he should be. He's my dad." A few people in the audience smiled politely, not yet understanding the weight of his words. "He's the strongest person I know, not because of his muscles, but because of how much he never gave up. He raised me all by himself since I was 5 after my mom died. He worked long hours, did every job he could find, cleaned floors, fixed broken things, and still made it home in time to help me with homework." Michael's hands began to tremble, but he didn't move. He didn't want to miss a second. "He used to be in the army, but he doesn't talk about it much," Jake continued. "I only know because I found his old medals one day hidden in a drawer, and when I asked, he said they didn't matter. But they do. Because I've seen what real strength looks like, and it's not loud, it's quiet. It's waking up early every day, even when you're tired. It's showing up to every school event, even when people stare. It's choosing to stay when life gets hard. Some people say you have to wear a uniform to be a hero, but I think heroes wear tired eyes and calloused hands and hearts that keep giving." A hush fell over the crowd, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full. Michael could feel every eye starting to turn toward him, now whispers, fading, replaced by something slower, something like understanding. Jake took a breath, and his voice softened. "I wrote this because I wanted everyone to know that just because someone doesn't look like a hero doesn't mean they're not one. My dad is the bravest man I know, and today I honor him." He looked toward the back of the gym and smiled at Michael. "Thank you for being my hero, Dad." The room burst into applause, loud and long and full of feeling. Michael blinked fast, trying to hold back tears, as Jake stepped off the stage and returned to his seat with his head high and his heart wide open. But before the clapping could end, something unexpected happened again. General Carter began to walk down the center aisle of the gym, each step slow, and sure, his eyes fixed on one man. The room grew quiet, once more the sound of his boots echoing off the walls as teachers and students moved aside to let him pass. No one spoke, no one even whispered this time, they just watched. Michael stood frozen, unsure what was happening, unsure what he should do. Then General Carter stopped right in front of him, close enough to reach out and shake his hand, but he didn't. Instead, he looked Michael in the eye and gave a sharp, crisp salute, the kind only given to those who truly deserve it. The kind that says, "I see your service, I see your sacrifice, I see your strength." Michael didn't move at first, his breath caught in his throat again. Then slowly, like the rising of the sun, he returned the salute, his hand rising steady and strong despite the weight of the years behind it. The gym seemed to hold its breath around them, as if time itself had paused to witness this moment. Then General Carter spoke, his voice clear, but quiet just enough for those nearby to hear. "He's not just your hero," he said to Jake, who had come running toward them now. "He's mine too." The applause began again, this time louder, more honest, less polite, and more full of respect. Michael looked around and saw something different in the faces of the crowd. Not pity, not judgment, but something warmer, something real. The general placed a hand on Michael's shoulder, then turned and walked back down the aisle, his presence like a wave that had come and gone, but left the whole room changed. Michael stood still, holding the bouquet tighter than ever, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Seen. Michael stood there frozen as the applause echoed through the gym, louder and stronger than before, each clap like a wave washing over him. He had come to this school just to see his son speak, just to be present, but something had changed, something big. People were no longer looking through him, now they were truly seeing him. A teacher walked over and gently touched his arm, her eyes soft and kind and full of something that looked a lot like respect. "You must be Jake's father," she said, her voice warm and real. Michael nodded, unsure what to say, unsure if words could even form in his mouth right now. He gave a small smile, and the teacher smiled back, and then stepped away to let him breathe. Jake ran down the aisle, then straight into his dad's arms, hugging him tightly, without fear or shame, without care for who was watching. Michael wrapped his arms around his son, holding him like he used to when Jake was small, when Jake cried for his mom at night, when the house was cold and the fridge was nearly empty, but love still filled every corner. "You did amazing," Michael whispered into Jake's ear, his voice shaking like leaves in the wind. "I'm proud of you." Jake looked up, his eyes bright and full of something more than joy. "I'm proud of you, Dad." The gym slowly returned to normal as students returned to their seats and the teacher returned to the microphone, ready to continue the program. But the room felt different now, calmer, gentler, more aware. The next student went up to the stage and spoke about her grandfather and his service in the Navy. But even as she spoke, eyes kept drifting back to the man in the back with the bouquet and the boy by his side. When the ceremony ended, families began to stand, some heading for the exits, others forming small groups to talk and take pictures. Michael stood still, unsure whether to stay or go, unsure whether he wanted to talk or disappear again. Then something happened that surprised him again. The woman with the pearl necklace, the one who had whispered earlier and laughed with her friend, walked over slowly, her steps careful, her face different now. She looked at him, then at Jake, and then back at him again, and for a moment she said nothing. Michael waited, thinking she might turn around or pretend it never happened. But she didn't. She reached out her hand and said softly, "I'm sorry. I judged you before I even knew your name, before I knew your story." Her voice cracked, and she blinked fast as if trying to keep something inside from falling out. "You're a good father, and I was wrong." Michael looked at her hand, then slowly reached out and shook it. "Thank you," he said, his voice gentle. "We've all got stories," he added, "and not all of them are easy to see." The woman nodded, then turned and walked away, her head a little lower, but her heart maybe a little lighter. More people came over after that, some offering kind words, others just giving small nods of respect. One man said, "My brother was in your unit. I think he mentioned you once." Another said, "I wish I had half your strength." One by one they came, not to talk about medals or uniforms or war stories, but to thank him for something simpler, something real. Being a father. Being present. Being strong when no one was watching. Jake stood close the whole time, sometimes squeezing his dad's hand, sometimes smiling wide as strangers praised the man he had always known was special. Michael had never liked attention. He had always stayed quiet, stayed humble, stayed in the background. But today he stood tall, not because he wanted praise, but because for once someone had seen his quiet fight and said it mattered. The general had left the gym earlier without a word, but his presence still hung in the air like smoke from a slow fire, something powerful, something impossible to forget. Before leaving, Michael and Jake took one last look at the stage where the banner still hung, where the flags still waved gently in the breeze from the ceiling fans. Then they walked toward the exit, side by side, step for step, heart for heart. Outside, the sky was turning orange with the afternoon sun, and the air smelled like warm grass and springtime. Jake looked up at his father and said with a smile, "I think today changed everything." Michael nodded, slow and steady, his eyes calm, now his heart full. Maybe it did. They walked across the parking lot with no rush, no fear, just quiet peace. And as they reached the car, Michael paused one last time and looked back at the school behind him. Not just a building anymore, but a place where something had shifted, something small but real, something that started with a whisper and ended with a salute. General Carter sat in his car parked just down the street from the school, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the dashboard, but his mind far away. The quiet hum of the engine was the only sound around him, the noise from the school, behind him, already fading into the past. But in his heart the moment had not passed. It had returned, and it brought memories he thought were buried. He closed his eyes for a second and saw sand again, felt heat, tasted dust. He saw Michael again, but not as the quiet man with tired eyes and flowers in his hand. He saw a young soldier standing in front of his unit, keeping him calm during the worst days when nothing made sense. Michael had never been loud, never chased medals, never gave speeches. But he had been steady and brave and loyal. He was the kind of man who gave others strength just by being there. The kind of man who listened more than he spoke. The kind of leader who didn't need a title to be followed. Back then Carter was a captain, fresh in his role, unsure of his choices, carrying pressure on his shoulders like heavy stone. And when things went wrong, when orders failed and fear filled every corner, it was Michael who stood up, not with words, but with presence. Michael had saved lives not with weapons, but with calm. He had given hope just by refusing to give up. But after the mission, after the dust and pain and loss, Michael disappeared into the background, never asked for credit, never stayed in touch, never claimed any honor. Until today, until Carter walked into that gym and saw the man again, holding flowers instead of weapons, standing alone, but strong beside his son. Carter had not planned to speak. He had come to watch his goddaughter perform in the choir. But when he saw Michael, something shifted. The past came back and demanded to be seen. So he saluted, not out of duty, but out of deep respect. And now, sitting in his car, he wondered if he had said enough, if he had honored the man the way he truly deserved. He looked at the passenger seat, where a small box rested, tied with a thin ribbon. Inside was something old, but full of meaning, something that had waited too long to be given. He reached for his phone and opened a contact list he had not touched in years. After a moment of silence, he tapped call. Michael answered after the second ring, his voice soft but steady. General Carter spoke with no formality, no titles, just truth. Michael, I have something that belongs to you. You might not want it, but I believe you earned it. Michael was quiet for a moment, then said, I never needed anything, sir, just wanted to do my part. You did more than that, Carter replied. You led without asking, you gave when no one saw, and you stood tall today like you always have. I want to meet, if that's all right with you. Michael agreed, and they chose a small park nearby, quiet and open under wide trees, where children laughed and dogs chased each other through the grass. When they met, Carter held out the box, and Michael hesitated before taking it. He opened it slowly, and inside was a metal one that had once been recommended for him, but somehow never delivered. Alongside it was a letter, handwritten and folded carefully, aged with time, but never forgotten. Michael looked at it, his hand still and his eyes deep with memory. He looked up at Carter and said, I don't know what to say. Say thank you, Carter replied with a small smile, then say nothing else and walk on with pride. They sat on a bench for a while, talking not like officers, but like men who had seen too much and kept going. Carter spoke of his own doubts, his own regrets, how easy it had been to forget the quiet heroes while chasing loud victories. Michael spoke of long nights of raising Jake alone, of missing his wife, of finding strength in small things like smiles and school papers, and quiet moments when Jake called him Dad. They talked as the sun dipped low and the sky turned soft with evening colors. Two men no longer strangers, but not quite the same as before. And as they stood to leave, Carter said one last thing. You may have walked away from the uniform, but you never walked away from your duty. Michael nodded and replied softly, I never served for the praise, I served because I believed it mattered. And it did, Carter said, more than you'll ever know. They parted with a handshake that meant more than medals or orders. And as Michael walked back to his car, the box in his hand and the letter in his pocket, he felt something inside shift. Not pride, not glory, just peace. And peace was enough. The next morning the sky was pale blue and quiet, with soft clouds moving slow, like they were in no hurry at all. Michael stood outside his house, holding the small box from the day before, still unopened again since he had come home. He had placed it on the kitchen table after the meeting with General Carter, but didn't look at it again until now. He watched the wind move the tree branches in front of his house and listened to the sound of birds calling to each other in the morning light. Jake came outside, still wearing his pajamas, holding a cup of orange juice and blinking from the sunlight. "Dad," he said softly, "are you okay?" Michael nodded, then smiled just a little, just enough for Jake to feel it. "Come sit with me," he said, and together they sat on the front steps, side by side, their shoulders touching, their silence easy and warm. Michael opened the box slowly again and took out the metal, its surface shining a little even in the gentle light of day. Jake looked at it with wide eyes, then looked up at his dad with something that wasn't just pride but deep, deep respect. "You earned that," Jake said quietly, "not just in the army, but every day since." Michael didn't say anything at first. He just nodded his head slowly, like the wind itself was moving it. He held the medal in his hand and felt the weight of it, not just the medal, but the memories, the pain, the choices, the years that shaped him. Then he handed the medal to Jake and said, "This is for you to keep one day, not because I want you to follow me, but because I want you to understand where you come from." Jake held the medal carefully, as if it could break, but also like it was gold. They stayed like that for a while, quiet, peaceful, until a car pulled up in front of the house, and a familiar face stepped out. It was Mr. Lewis, the school principal, wearing a blue suit and holding a small envelope in his hand. "Good morning," he said, walking up the path with a kind smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything, but I wanted to drop this off in person." Michael stood up and shook his hand while Jake watched with curiosity. Mr. Lewis handed him the envelope and said, "Yesterday was something none of us will forget. You reminded this community what real strength looks like, and we wanted to honor that." Michael opened the envelope, and inside was an invitation written in beautiful handwriting. It was an invitation to speak at the next town ceremony on Memorial Day as a guest of honor. Michael looked at the card, then back at Mr. Lewis, his eyes unsure. "I'm not used to speeches," he said. "I'm not sure I'd know what to say." "Just tell the truth," Mr. Lewis replied. "That's all people need to hear." Michael thanked him and walked back to the steps, where Jake was still sitting, medal in hand, a quiet smile on his face. "You should do it, Dad," he said. "You've spent your life giving and helping and staying in the background. Maybe now it's time people hear your voice too." Michael sat beside him again and took a long breath, the kind that fills the lungs and clears the thoughts. "Maybe you're right," he said softly. "Maybe it's time." That evening, as the sun began to set and the sky turned orange and gold with fading light, something happened that neither of them expected. A knock at the door, gentle but clear, and when Michael opened it, there stood a small group of people from the school and neighborhood. Some held candles, others carried cards or flowers, and a few brought food, but all of them brought something else too: gratitude. "We just wanted to say thank you," one woman said, her eyes bright. "You reminded us what service looks like, and we're better for it." Michael stepped aside and welcomed them, and not because he needed thanks, but because something in his heart had opened. The house filled with warm voices and quiet laughter, with stories and soft music and the smell of fresh bread and cookies. Jake walked around the room showing his dad's old medals to the neighbors, who listened with wonder, as if they had never seen anything so special. And Michael watched, not with pride, but with peace. Because, for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel like a shadow or a ghost from some forgotten story. He felt present, real, seen. Later that night, as the last guest left and the door closed softly behind them, Michael looked around his home. It looked the same, but felt different. He turned to Jake, who was already yawning, and said, "Thank you for standing up for me." Jake smiled and said, "You've stood for me every day." "Did I just did it once?" Michael walked over to the medal, placed it back in the box, gently, then looked out the window at the moon hanging high and full in the sky. And he whispered, more to himself than anyone else, "Maybe I do belong here after all." The town square was quiet in the early morning, the sun rising slowly over the trees and warming the faces of the small crowd already gathering near the stage. Rows of folding chairs lined the brick walkway, flags waved gently in the breeze, and children carried small paper signs that said, "Thank you, heroes." Michael stood behind the stage, holding the folded invitation in his hand, his heart beating steady, but strong like a quiet drum, reminding him of everything that brought him here. Jake stood beside him holding his hand just for a moment, like when he was small before a doctor visit or a big test. That little squeeze of comfort now passed back to the father who once gave it so many times before. "You ready, Dad?" Jake asked, his eyes bright and proud. Michael gave a small nod and took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the fresh morning air and something else too, something like peace mixed with courage. The mayor stepped up to the microphone, her voice clear and warm as she welcomed the town and spoke about the meaning of Memorial Day. She honored names of those who had fallen, those who had served, and those who continued to protect in silence and in strength. And now she said, "We welcome someone who served not only in uniform, but through love and sacrifice long after the battlefield, someone who reminds us what a true hero looks like even without the spotlight. Please welcome Michael Anderson." Applause filled the air as Michael walked slowly to the front, his footsteps careful, his eyes calm. He stood at the microphone for a moment, looking out at the faces in front of him, some familiar, some new, all waiting. He looked down at his notes, then looked back up and began to speak, his voice not loud, but clear like water running over smooth stone. "Thank you for letting me speak today. I never thought I would be up here. I never wore stars on my shoulder. I never gave orders in big rooms. I never led with a loud voice. But I served, and I came home, and I became something else. I became a father. I lost my wife when our son was 5, and I had to learn how to lead a different kind of mission. A mission that didn't come with maps or orders, just love and hope and hard work. Some days were long, some nights were longer, but every morning I looked at my son, and I knew why I kept going." Michael paused and looked at Jake sitting in the front row, smiling up at him, the kind of smile that said, "I see you, I believe in you. I used to think my service ended when I took off the uniform, but now I know that service never really ends. It changes. It becomes quieter. It becomes the way you show up for someone, the way you protect, without shields, the way you lead with patience, not power." He looked out at the crowd and saw heads nodding, eyes blinking, fast hands holding tissues. "A few weeks ago, I stood at the back of a school gym and felt like I didn't belong, like I was in the wrong place, wearing the wrong clothes. But then my son stood up and reminded me who I was. And a man I once served under stood up too and reminded others. Since that day, strangers have come up to me to say thank you, to say I matter. But the truth is, every one of us has someone like that in their life, someone who serves in silence, who gives without asking, who stays strong when no one is watching. Today is about remembering the fallen and honoring the brave. But let also be about seeing the quiet heroes around us right now. The ones who don't ask for praise, who don't stand on stages, who carry the weight and keep walking. He paused again, letting the silence speak. Then he said, "I'm proud to have served, and I'm proud to keep serving in the ways I can. Not with medals or speeches, but with love, with work, with being present for my son, and for anyone who needs to feel seen. Thank you for letting me be here." He stepped back, and for a moment there was no sound, only the soft rustle of flags and the quiet hush that falls when people are truly moved. Then the applause came, not rushed, not forced, but deep and honest and full. Jake ran up and hugged him tight, and this time the crowd stood as one. And in the back of the crowd, General Carter watched with quiet pride, his arms folded and his heart full. Michael had not just spoken words, he had spoken truth, and that truth had touched something in everyone who heard it. Later that day, as families walked through the square and children played with flags in the grass, Michael and Jake sat together on a bench under a tree, watching the world move gently around them. "You did it, Dad," Jake said, still holding his hand. Michael smiled and said, "Maybe we both did." And as the sky turned soft with evening light and the day came to a close, Michael felt something he had not felt in a long time. Home.